Good question. Okay, welcome, Danielle. So this is our training staff for the police department. That we have 5 full-time staff that are dedicated to the training academy. Myself, I'm the training director. Sergeant Salamanca, who's the assistant director, he's here. Sergeant Matt Cobb, who runs our basic academy. We have the range master who runs all of our firearms training, and Sergeant Jepson, and Sergeant Campos, who's over recruiting and hiring and has maybe the most challenging job on the planet right now. And the things that we are going to cover in tonight's public input session are our basic academy certification, as well as our continuing officer education. So they fall into 2 different categories. Our recruit officer training. This is somewhat small, but and I'm not going to give you death by PowerPoint, but basic law enforcement training is actually run by a state agency, Kansas CPOST, which is the Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training, which is a governor-appointed board and grants certification to all officers. The certification that they set changed in 2022. So as of January of 2022, state of Kansas now requires a certification exam before it will certify its law enforcement officers. That has not occurred prior to 2022. Prior to that, it was simply the completion of the required number of hours. So the state of Kansas governing board requires 560 hours of basic law enforcement training before you can test to be certified. The Topeka Police Department runs our academy, and it's roughly between 780 to 820 hours. The reason there is some variance there, some of the things vary by class size. So if we have a class size of 3 to 5, it's much more expedient to get proficiency in some of those hands-on physical training aspects, some of those firearms, emergency vehicle operations, the things that need more one-on-one instruction than rather a classroom lecture. So it slows the process down so that we can train to a standard, not necessarily a time frame, if that makes sense. And so as of 2022, like I said, the state of Kansas has implemented testing requirements. So our recruits now have to carry a minimum average to even be allowed to take the state certification exam. And if they fail the state certification exam, there's then a remediated process. The state will allow them to remediate and take it again. However, the agency can decide whether they want to allow that or not. Has not been an issue for us. We have witnessed some other agencies within the state of Kansas actually have someone fail their certification exam and have to retake it. So that testing consists of a written exam. The written exam has, I think, 100 questions, and they're all more than like a true false question. They are scenario-based questions. So it will give you officer so-and-so arrives to this, what crimes have occurred, what actions should they take? So they're critical thinking questions. And that's the purpose of the change, is to stop training memorization and start training critical thinking, right? So we want you to take the scenario and make decisions like you're going to on the street, not memorize A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And so I really like the change. We've done 1 class under that change, and the current class, the second class going through. So Kansas CPOST at the state level also does not mandate field training. So there is no governance over what a field training program looks like in the state of Kansas, which is considered on the job training. And so that's set by our agency. So I'll pass it over to Sergeant Salamanca to briefly talk about the FTO program and what that consists of, because that is his baby. And he oversees all of the FTOs, the field training supervisors, and the recruit training. But again, it's important to keep in mind the state does not mandate what we do for field training, and we have no to go by, so this is built on an agency level.
Thank you, Lieutenant. See that? So my name is Sergeant Ruben Salamanca. As Lieutenant said, I'm the Assistant Director of Training, and one of my functions there is to oversee the field training program. So when an officer graduates the Recruit Academy, he segues into a live environment, which is working in patrol. And so our field training program runs in 4 phases, what you see here. So each recruit, as they go through a phase, they are assigned a different field training officer. Field training officers are selected based on a number of qualifications. We have an interview process. We have 24 hours of mandatory training they need to get to be able to understand how to train other adults, adult learning theory and things of that nature. And then after graduation, they're assigned to their phase 1 field training officer. After 6 weeks of phase one, which is kind of we look at our field training as kind of a crawl, walk, run type of training. And so based on the performance of the recruit, if he's successful in that first 18 weeks of training, he goes to what's called a solo observation phase, which is phase 4, as you see up there. And phase 4 is an observational phase in which the recruit now will be only observed and have to make all the decisions, work the radio, go to calls. He's pretty much growing independent from his training officer. If he's successful in that final 2 weeks of training, the field training officer and the field training supervisor will then come back to the training division, meet with myself, Lieutenant Cross, and a couple of field operations commanders, and they will basically make their case. And that case would be that this officer is ready to be released on their own based on their performance. We have a significant amount of documentation that we analyze and that we review throughout that process, so there's a lot of early detection. If the officer is not successful and does not meet our standards, then we may extend that officer's training, maybe remediate him, bring him back to the academy for some remedial training, or assign him to a different FTO so that we can, work with that person and get them where they need to be before they go to the street on their own. I pretty much covered, a lot of what the field training is kind of in a nutshell. There's a lot of different administrative tasks involved. Like, for example, we have 4 field training supervisors that are sergeants on that work patrol, and they help facilitate and oversee the recruit. They have what's called biweekly meetings with the recruit, and they work more as a mentor because of the complexities and personalities and just different things when you're training with different training officers. One of the things that we do constant is that the FTS, our field training supervisor, he stays with that recruit throughout the entire 20 weeks. So the recruit will change different field training officers. He always stay with that main field training supervisor. So the field training sergeant, in a sense, could be kind of a mentor or a confidant. If there's any personal issues or anything going on, they could speak to their field training supervisor. Every 2 weeks, the field training supervisor will meet with the recruit, document an assessment of where that recruit is at, provide that input back to us, and we make a decision or determination where he or she is at in their training. Additionally, the field training supervisors have to do a ride-along, that means that they'll ride with the recruit as they are the field training officer, just to observe and make sure that the field training officer is consistent in their training, and that any documentation that the field training officer provided is accurate and consistent. So they take that observational phase as well. So that's kind of how the field training program runs. Kind of remembering if I'm forgetting anything. A lot of documentation that goes into it, more than I can probably talk about here in 10 minutes. But they do daily reports, self-evaluations. That's another piece that we added to our field training program. So they are being evaluated constantly. Every week they evaluate themselves. So they go to a PC, they sit down and do their own documentation, and they give, they're very candid generally on where they think they are. And it's actually very insightful because it helps the trainer kind of gear the training to fit that person's personality. So if the person is struggling and maybe working the radio, multitasking, things like that, we'll try to get more repetitions in that. If the recruit needs to be exposed to DUI investigations, we'll try to accommodate those kind of things. So we're very, very flexible. We do everything to make that recruit successful in this endeavor. One of the unique things about phase 4, that I didn't mention, is that when they go to phase 4, they actually go back to the original field training officer. So if the field training officer trained that person in phase 1, when they get to phase 4, he'll get that recruit back. The idea is that that field training officer should see and observe a significant amount of growth in that recruit since when he first received him, basically 18 weeks prior to that. So that's kind of a neat thing that we do in the field training officers. It's very rewarding for the field training officers to be able to observe that change. As you can see here, I think I went backwards, didn't I? Am I going into your area? Okay. So that's kind of the field training program in a nutshell. I'll go ahead and turn this back over to the lieutenant to talk about in-service.
So basic hiring is the first phase of what we do. That 780 to, what did I say? 780 to 820 hours, that does not include the field training program. So the field training program is on top of that. So that's the 6 months following that. We are also responsible for the annual education of our officers. So Kansas City Post, again, is very open-ended with what the state level requirement is. So they mandate 40 hours of in-service. Most civilian personnel refer to that as continuing education, which is a common term in the education field, the medical field. And so we're required to have 40 hours of continuing education every year. The only thing that is actually mandated by Kansas City Post is bias-based policing, and that is mandated by state law. So it is actually statutorily required. The other thing that is actually mandated by law is hazardous materials training. And it's a familiarization level, but there is a federal statute that says we have to update that. And so the other things are these specific topics up here are things that TPD has gone above and beyond the state standard and said we require of this of our officers every single year. So one of the things that happens with our 40 hours of training, it is mandated by the state that you cannot have more than 16 hours that is firearms. So there has to be at least 24 of those hours that are outside some sort of firearms. So if you're a firearms instructor or you're a guy who enjoys the tactical side of things, there is a limit on what you can apply to those continuing education. The other is you're limited to the number you can do virtually. So there was a state exception for the COVID period where no one hosted training and you couldn't go to training because you couldn't be gathered. And so there was an extension of the number of virtual hours for that short abbreviated time period. But we're back to the expectation that 20 of these hours must be in-person, hands-on learning. They cannot be in a virtual environment. So a recorded video does not count. And so these are the topics that TPD has required of our officers over what the state does. So you can see what those are there and you can take note. We can come back and forth to this slide, but if you have questions on the specifics of that, we can get into that. But ethics, CIT and mental health, the defensive tactics, firearms, first aid and CPR, and then every year, mostly twice a year, we have the legal updates. So when the legislative session updates, we get these are the changes to the law. Here's how this stuff applies. So our in-service trainings are held by TPD and they're required to come. We also host optional classes. I think last year we were, Ruben, I think upwards of 150 classes that we offered as options for training. So we are continuously bringing in training. One of the things that having a separate training site and dedicated academy staff allows us to do is to advertise and host regional trainings, which benefits the city as a whole because a lot of times we will get complimentary spots in those training classes. So rather than spending our training budget, we host the class, we set up the equipment, we provide a space similar to something like this. And so we are allowed to send 1 or 2 people at no cost to the city, which has helped us stretch our training budget a significant amount. I think one of the best examples of that is our new CIT or our new CSI officers that do forensic stuff. We have a 40-hour class that's coming in this week. We had 2 free spots, but because of the effort Sergeant Salamanca has put into host, we just named a new officer who's going to join that unit, and they offered us an extra comp spot for him to attend because of our hosting duties, because it's quite an undertaking to have offsite agencies come in and clean up after them and host facilities and, bathroom facilities, all of those things. And then at the bottom, officers may seek self-initiated training. However, you can't just go out and do whatever you want. The agency and the training department has to approve that it applies to the continuing education credits. So we have a training request process where you have to submit who's hosting that training, what's the value to the agency, and what are the topics that are covered. And so then there's a decision made in the chief's office with the input of training as to whether that will be allowed to count or not. So we really scrutinize what our officers are going to for training. So before we open for questions, I did want to take a second and highlight one of the things that we have recently implemented as an agency is this fancy new training tracking software. So no surprise that most people are going digital with everything, and our training files are individually kept. They're scanned documents, so you have to turn in the pieces of paper, we have to scan them in. It becomes quite cumbersome. So this program outlines your training plan every year. and updates you as to the progress that you're making. It also allows, so you can look at this and see what our mandatory units of training are, but any officer or any supervisor can access their personnel and say, okay, this is the progress you've made. This looks very gray, not very green. It's important to note that our training year is not a calendar year. The state legislates our training year to be July 1 through June 30th. It's maybe the most frustrating thing about my job, because who operates in that year? No one. And so it's so this has helped us, because instead of knowing what training we went through January through December, this has an expiration date. You have to complete these topics before June 30th hits, and we can run flags and say, hey, we're coming up to June 30th. What have you not been to? So the other thing is that it allows us to track. So if I look at the history of the trainings I've been to, I can pull up any course that someone has been to, and I can not only see when they attended, the number of hours, I can see who instructed it, and I can actually access the content of what was taught in the training. So instead of just sign-in sheets, which is what the state requires, a sign-in sheet showing where you went to training and what you went to, for the vast majority of the training, at least for the trainings we host, we can archive the content. And so we're not looking for some other entity to turn over their training presentations to us, because a lot of that stuff's proprietary, right? You go to training and you say, can I have your presentation? Well, no, because you're not going to make money off of it. But when we have that, we can archive it. And so the officer can access it as a reference, but we can not only talk about what training you went to, but we can pull up the content of that training. So this system has been, I really like it. And I think the more people use it, we implemented this last January, and we did a 6-month T&E, and it went live with this training year on July 1st. So everything we've done since July 1st has been tracked in this system, and is super accessible, super transparent. With that, what questions do you guys have? You have to talk into the microphone.
I know it is, and you don't. It doesn't have the. Yeah. Great. Okay. So with the 40 hours, there's 9 required topics. So officers get to choose how much of each topic. Okay. Oh.
Does this one work too, or no? I think that's for this system, right? No? Okay, Ronaldo says no, we have to use this one, I think. Okay, so if you look at this credential, there's a minimum of what they have to have. So 1 unit, and whether that's 2 hours, 3 hours, legal updates can sometimes be a 4-hour block class. It just depends on how big the legislative session is, but they have to meet a minimum. And then if you look at the bottom here, in this overflow of other, right here, everything else gets filed away under other. However, if it falls into other, and let's say, I'm trying to think of one, somebody just did one that I put in 2 places. I cannot remember what it was, but we can apply it. Let's say you have to have 2 hours of ethics training, and you went to a class that was a week-long class, and there was 1 day of ethics. You can apply the 2 hours to ethics, and then everything else goes into another category, so it's not labeled. But a lot of this stuff is cross-curricular. What this program also allows us to do is that if there's a training class, it has learning objectives assigned to it. I can give you an example of one of our basic classes. So, like, this is a class for our basic academy. And you can see this spot for learning objectives. So when these classes are built and reviewed, these are learning objectives that are developed by the Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center that they've established as 7 core competencies. All of those documents are available. I can share them with you before you guys leave if you want. But so like, these are the learning objectives in this particular class. So PU, develop an appreciation of the concepts of lawful authority, explain how law enforcement represents the face of government. And so you'll find that a lot of these learning objectives make their way through different classes. What this system allows us to do that we haven't been able to do before is that like this class is called procedural justice and ethics. But if there's something about justifying enforcing unpopular laws, I can search that by that learning objective and say, okay, we only logged 1 hour of ethics training. However, this ethics learning objective was inserted in 8 different classes this year. So the whole focus of that class wasn't ethics, and we don't want to report it that it was a full hour and a half of ethics, but it was a learning objective and part of the curriculum to that course. And so it's expanding the amount of detail we can report what's in there. Does that make sense? They do not get to choose the number of hours. We apply that, and then they can go above and beyond. The only thing that's capped is firearms, which you can attend 100 hours of firearms training, but you're only getting credit for 16.
Sorry, how many hours of defense?
So the minimum mandatory is for them to have 2 hours. And we've also changed our in-service training just this year. So rather than what we've historically done is pulled officers off the streets or out of their primary job function, and they come and they sit through 3 days of in-service training where we hit everything all at once. I don't learn well that way, and I think you lose attention. So we've tried to break this up to more adult learning styles, and I can demonstrate this too. So what we've done is we've implemented kind of in-service on their shift and where they're at. So one of the things we're working on is like defensive tactics. So you can look at this. Can you read that? Okay. So you can read this and it will show you, this is how many training days we have scheduled for the month of September. And you see them broken down by shift. So we can do these if we identify issue. Let's say we run into an issue with application of handcuffs and people are not applying handcuffs as efficiently as we would like. We can do a 2-hour block of handcuffing because we already have a block of training set up, and we can change these in and out. Let's say a new Supreme Court case law comes out, a new court finding. We don't have to wait for the mandatory legal update training. We can come in and push that in and go, you guys need to know this right now. So here's your built-in training days. And so the mandatory is 2 hours of defensive tactics, but all these elective days are built to provide anything that we find that we need to revisit that's urgent or that we need to get out right now instead of waiting for the next round of in-service.
Now with these trainings, are they, if you let them come in and do it on their own, are they video training or are they in-person training?
So no, so these are scheduled, and what we do is we actually select the topics based on either timing. If it, like I said, if there's a new Supreme Court case law that comes out that we need to do, we can affect that. If there's something that came through a complaint file where there was a complaint filed and we identified an issue that we want to revisit with our officers, we can choose to do that. But this is not on their own. We still schedule it. We still provide the instructors, the curriculum, the outline. We still build that class out that shows this is what you're doing. We just allow more opportunities for them to go rather than having to pull them off the street for 8 days at a time, and rather for having 2 blocks of training, one in the fall and one in the spring. The goal is to offer training throughout the year so that it's more fresh and it's more repetitive. Does that make sense? So they're on their shift as well, so it's less disruptive to their sleep cycles. We're not bringing third shift officers back to day shift for the convenience of us. Some of the instructors have not really liked coming in to teach legal updates at 2 a.m., but it's inconvenient to one person as opposed to an entire shift of people. So we're trying to accommodate making training less disruptive, which I think opens up the receptiveness to it because we're bringing it to them. Does that make sense?
Do officers have an opportunity to provide regular feedback on what they want more training of?
So we have a training committee. The training committee is represented by every bureau in all the shifts. So investigators, and we have actually, I think that's been our biggest push in the last 12 months, is to both reach out to the public as well as the officers about where do you think we need to focus some of our training. So yes, we've sought input. One of the most recent things that came out of that is that the officers were telling us we get called to a lot of civil disputes. It's landlord-tenant. It's the dispute of, can I kick them out? Can I not kick them out? We brought in a civil attorney who came in and answered questions on what rights we have and how to handle when we don't have if this is not a criminal act. Like, the police are here because you don't know what to do, but we need to give you valid input on how to navigate this because it's not a crime, right? And so it's not really a police matter, but it's a call to police because they don't know who else to call. And now we had this civil attorney who came in. The feedback was received phenomenally. We've also started putting out evaluation sheets for in-service. I think my biggest complaint about in-service in the past has been we're checking boxes or we're doing this to say we did it, and it's very repetitive. We're trying to move away from that and make it valuable time. So we're actually providing feedback sheets from saying, what did you like, what did you not like, what did you need more of? I just got a request for another topic to be covered in FOB over the sale of vehicles between private parties, right? And how that becomes disruptive because they don't have a 30-day tag. The paperwork might be messed up. It could be fraudulent, and how the officers can identify pieces within that. So we're working to make it more what they're seeing, more what they're doing, instead of assuming we know. And the other push we've made is to stop relying exclusively on our internal personnel to teach. And we've outsourced a lot of it to community members. Stormont Vale came in and did first aid and CPR training instead of having a police officer do it. I talked about the civil attorney who came in and did that. I think it's very important to receive training from outside entities and not just train our own. And so that's another direction that we're trying to expand and bring in people who aren't just us, if that makes sense.
No, so with defensive tactics, so, you know, increasing how we've done CIT training, and I see that regularly having those trainings and even bringing in community agencies to participate, you know, all of those things as that way to address de-escalation tactics and all those. But a core piece that feels like maybe could also be improved in that same realm is having officers increase those defensive tactics, those disarming techniques, the physical hand-to-hand type of ability where their comfort level with that physical engagement is there. You know, if we have 16 hours of making sure we're super comfortable reaching for our weapon, the default to that situation.
No, and let me clarify that. We don't have 16 hours of firearms training either. We do 2 qualifications, and they're required to have 2 hours of firearms training. So the level that's required. The 16 hours is just that you can't apply more than that to your 40 hours. Does that make sense? So it's capped by the state. It says you can't go train 110 hours of firearms and get all of your credits. You have to have some diversity in what you're training on. And yes, so part of why we moved to this elective, these are shorter blocks of training. So these are designed to be in 2 or 4 hour blocks and can be done on the shift, because some of the feedback we got when we asked the officers is that when we come to defensive tactics training, we throw on our jeans and our polo shirts and we're hearing this training attire. And then when we're on the street, we have 30 pounds of equipment. We have a bulletproof vest. Our mobility is impacted. Things that can be grabbed on, things that can be hung on are impacted. So this last time it was come in uniform, come as you are, offload all weapons, and we're going to do this in uniform. We're working on one for our investigators who don't hardly ever have to get into use of force because they're mostly in interview settings. But when they do, it's in a 5x5 interview room. And so it's actually close quarters defensive tactics where they become more proficient and more comfortable affecting what needs to be done in that small area. And you're exactly right. The benefit of being more comfortable with your defensive tactics is that things get de-escalated more quickly with less injuries to officers and to citizens. And so we have heard that feedback from our officers. I would say the vast majority of these will be some sort of specific, we've talked about transition drills. If you have a flashlight and you need to drop that and go hands-on, how to get that repetitiveness of being able to do so. And so yes, the goal is to implement those on here, but to do them if it's a driver in a car and you need to be able to apply a tactic to a driver in a car, that enables you to not have to resort to disengaging and pulling a firearm, that's what we want. We want you to be comfortable with, the extraction through the window if that's what's necessary to de-escalate that immediately. So that is the focus.
On the physical fitness part, is it just when you're going through the academy, or is it annual? And one more question. When you're doing the training, or like you said, where they having to wear their uniform and everything like that, are you doing any type of exercises prior to that before they actually get into it? Because, once you get into it, your heartbeat is going, it's whole different.
That's a great question. I can answer this one personally. I just did our fall defensive tactics that ended with a requirement that you actually get into a ground fight and you have to get on the radio, and the time for your fight to be over does not even begin until you're able to call yourself on the radio and tell someone that you need help. And what we found was an alarming, holy cow, 30 seconds feels like 111 years. And so, yes, we're going to more scenario-based training where we're not stagnant standing on a mat going, okay, apply this to your partner who's going to comply, because that's what we do, right? It's a repetition. It is, okay, I just took your feet out. I'm on top of you. What are you going to do? And so we were actually engaging. And I can tell you that Matt can probably speak to this, and Ruben probably can too. It felt like an eternity. And you quickly know having all this on is going to be a whole different ball game than if I'm standing in a pair of jeans after just coming back from Subway from lunch. And so that is our goal. Our goal is to make it more realistic. As far as the physical training, we do not have a physical training requirement. We do a lot of PT in the basic academy. We do not have a physical training requirement beyond that, and they are not tested annually. I know that all of those things have been suggested and brought up, and I think you will find that there's significant amount of support for that. It's just a matter of what does that look like? How do you implement that? And how is that there? Matt can maybe speak to that from an FOP standpoint, but I don't think there's anybody who would argue we want to be in the best shape we can be in. Hi, Sylvia. How you doing?
So I saw training, and this might be a different type of training than what we're talking about. So, so kind of two questions here. One, definitely, I know I've heard you speak before, and I'm trying to piece together of implicit bias training as being a piece of just even in those initial phases, understanding what our implicit biases are, how they impact how we view and see, right? And then that ongoing. But secondly, what training do we have on, for instance, the Department of Justice has deemed, white supremacy extremist groups as our biggest threat. And we've had several groups within our community actively engaging recently. And so what kind of training is our department doing to identify that?
So a lot of and I use training, but a lot of the information on that stuff comes through our criminal intelligence bulletins and through shared information across different agencies. Those things are revisited when things happen or when reports like that come out. Those are part of the legal updates training. They can also be part of, like I said, weekly bulletins from criminal intel, and then those go into accessible folders that our officers can access. The implicit bias stuff, we have got, and I can pull the learning objectives, but there are several that are throughout our entire curriculum where that comes up over and over. And then we have part of the reason ours is longer is that we actually have a dedicated one that's done at the end of our academy that's called What Does Racism Look Like to TPD? And then Ruben does some training as well on some implicit bias stuff. He's got some really good stories and some really good training anecdotes that he could share with you. I won't steal his thunder, but a couple of them even that the first time I heard them was like, wow, that is like the most telling thing that he can probably share. But so those do find their way into training consistently. And you're right, we have talked about and are working on some programs that will highlight that implicit bias in a less threatening way. Because I think one of the things we talk about is bias-based policing, racism, and people automatically relate bias to you're racist, when bias is a whole lot more than that. And what happens is bias gets a negative connotation, and so people deny it. And the reality of it is we all have bias. It exists in every single one of us. And so if I equate bias to something negative, or I equate it to I'm racist, I'm going to deny it instead of embracing where my bias lies so that I can address it. I think it comes down to you can't attack something that you don't know. And so if you're defending that because there's such a negative image that pops up, and that's where our training goes, is that bias is not a bad word. Everybody has bias, right? My kids have bias when they go to school. The hair on your neck, that's bias. It's created by something that you can't tangibly talk, but something taught you, and you have to follow that. But you also have to know what might be causing it and how to overcome it if it's there. And you can't overcome it if you won't acknowledge it. You got something, Sylvia? Okay.
So Rodney mentioned like increasing the heart rate, those kinds of things prior. Also, it kind of maybe falls under the officer. Well, I think I read the wellness. Are those things a piece of the training process too, about, calming tactics, recentering, those pieces?
Yes, and our most recent in-service actually contained an officer wellness component talking about sleep habits, eating habits, physical activity habits. I've suggested that in some of these electives, I haven't got this one approved yet because they actually laughed at me, but I think we should have law enforcement yoga because of the mindfulness that it brings. And I really think that while people snicker at it, and it's like, first of all, anybody that's ever done yoga knows that there's going to be a lot of embarrassed people in the room who think they're Billy Bad A and then can't stretch their leg up like that. But it's very, we've worked very hard to bring in a bunch of stuff like that. And in fact, I talked last time about our physical fitness incentive, where we don't require it, but we incentivize it, and bringing that into in-service timeframes instead of requiring people to do it on their own time, and making it more of a priority, because healthier officers obviously are better officers. So yeah, that's a big push.
The incentivizing then, like finding time for all the things is just, yes, impossible. But to incentivize being healthy, is there thoughts of incentivizing, okay, instead of you using your time at the gym, we can partner with someone in the community who teaches those tactics and incentivize. Yeah.
And so we've had a couple with our basic recruit class. We've had a couple different private places that have offered us the ability to come in and test that. It hasn't gone across the agency yet, but I also know that there have been several suggested programs for implementing that into the officer shifts. And it's a matter of figuring out how that works, what that looks like, and how to do so with the limited resources we have, because our manpower is always an issue. I think that's our biggest obstacle to training a lot of times is I don't have the time to send people, which is why we're also trying to take it to the shifts, because I can come in and instead of taking you and pulling you off the street for 10 hours, I can give you 2 hours of training and then you can hit the street again. And you're dressed and ready to go. So if the proverbial crap hits the fan, everybody can deploy and we still have resources at our disposal. So that's why we've really tried to shift how we're delivering training to better serve the community and the officers, which I think has contributed to more receptiveness to what we're offering in training, because it's not so disruptive, right? No one, I think before we started today, you were like, well, I've been here and so I'm way out of the loop, and how disruptive that gets to your system and your life. And so if you can remove that, I think you're more open to receiving what you're getting. So that's what we're trying to do.
On firearms training, how many times do you get to qualify, if you could say that? If not, and are you qualifying in uniform? So you mean like how many opportunities? Okay, so we have policies in place if someone were to fail their firearms certification. It's not unlimited, and what happens if you can't, I think it's 3 times and then you're pulled off the street until you can be remediated and you get one-on-one training.
As far as do we qualify in uniform? Yes, you bring the equipment that you carry on the street. So like I qualify with this because this is what I wear daily. If you're in detectives, you would come with like the holster you wear on your dress clothing and you qualify with that.
Are the weapons supplied by TPD and are the ammo supplied by TPD?
Yep, everything is supplied by the department, holsters, weapons, ammunition. If you carry a backup weapon, it has to be inspected, approved by the armorer, and you have to qualify with what you carry it. Like if you carry an ankle holster, or some people carry it like in their vest, you have to qualify with that equipment as well, and it has to be inspected by the armorer and approved through a memo through the agency in order for you to carry it. So your duty firearm, holster, and weapon and ammunition are provided by the department. If you provide your own weapon as a backup, it has to be in a written memo format, it has to be approved by the department armorer. Yes, it all has to be approved. Correct. But it still has to be approved and documented what you have. Correct. Yep.
Do officers get to choose their intermediate weapon?
So we have standard issued intermediate weapons. We all carry these expandable batons, the pepper spray, and most carry a taser. I do not carry a taser. Ruben carries a taser. Matt, do you have a taser? I think most have a taser. You have to train with the weapon that you carry, and if you go back to that, it says we have to train with the intermediate weapon. The other thing that we've implemented is that even if you don't carry one, you go to the training. So like I don't carry a taser, I'm still required to take the minimum number of taser hours so that when someone else uses a taser, or if I were to, if I show up in Ruben's in a fight and his taser has made it to the ground, I understand how that weapon works, how to deploy it, what to do, what the concerns are, how to provide aftercare, what reporting necessities are. So even if you don't carry that weapon, you train under that weapon so that there's the exposure. To say, do they get to choose it? No, but we have like a Batman belt. And so you get to choose what's appropriate in that moment based on the resistance you're encountering for what you deploy. But it's not like a discriminatory, like, I want that, but not that. You train on all of it. No, I mean, the tasers are more limited by position. Like our detectives generally don't carry the tasers because there's a limited number you can carry when you're wearing a pair of chinos, right? And also because they're not really in positions where they should need to use those, and they would have like a but they are required by policy to carry an intermediate weapon. Most of them choose to carry pepper spray because of the size of it. Like it's less cumbersome than this, but some of them do have a smaller expandable baton than this that's about, I don't know, about half wide. But they are required to have an intermediate weapon. They cannot just carry a firearm. I know.
What intermediate weapons are the officers in patrol required to carry?
They're not required to carry a significant number of them. Like they don't all have to carry a taser. Some people don't carry a taser, but they are issued, if desired, a taser, pepper spray, and these. I believe almost everybody in patrol has tasers now and are required to carry them if patrol is their primary function. So if you're in a black and white car, I don't carry a taser because it wouldn't be good use of the city's money for me to have a taser because most of the time I'm pushing paper behind a desk. But patrol officers carry the taser, the expandable batons, the firearm, obviously, and the pepper spray. The less lethal munitions. Okay, so those are actually, they're not like carried on your belt. It's like a shotgun, and I believe they're now carried in all the supervisor cars. Is that right? I know that that's the push. We don't have the significant number of them. We started with like 2 or 3 that were only response team members that were trained on them, but we have certified more people at the supervisory level to carry those in an effort to make them more accessible if they're needed. So the goal is to have one in every supervisor car. Less lethal munitions. They're like beanbag rounds. I honestly can't tell you that. I don't know all the ins and outs of all the weaponry, but oh yeah, they have a special, actually, one of the functions of this system as well is that we can keep track of that as well. And this is what we're working on, building these groups out. So all of these specialty groups, there's a gajillion of them. But anybody who's certified with a taser is listed in here as that they're taser certified. If they are certified taser instructor, less lethal, are they a trained EMT? Are they a CIT trained officer? Those kinds of things. And what we're working towards is that they'll have a credential in here, so it will tell us this is how long their certification is good for, this is when it expires, so that we're making sure that people are staying. Because some of the things that we've encountered in the past are, hey, my certification expires 2 months from now, and now we're scrambling to find training. And so this will give us a notification that says, hey, in 6 months, Matt's certification is going to expire. He needs to go to the recertification training. And then we don't get behind the curveball of people expiring or running out without making sure we have the right number of people certified. So there's a whole laundry list of specialties on here. Bike certified, canine. Some have gone so far, want to have, appreciate that's a Matt Wilson thing. He wants his own specialty group for his squad. But this system allows us to track a lot of different things that we haven't previously been able to have at the fingertips of. It was more relegated to the specialty unit. Okay, who on the response team has these certifications? Who as a canine has these certifications? Is it bomb? Is it drug? Is it, now anybody can pull that up and go, this is who it is.
Does that data then allow to make sure that there are trained in those specialties available at different areas?
So that's the other part we're working on right now. The only credential we've built is the annual in-service, because we've only been using the system since July. But the goal is to build it as, if you're a bomb tech, I know that you have to have these different classes every single year, and it'll keep a running tally of what you have and what you don't have. So it's an at-a-glance view, so that nothing gets overlooked. There's no overlooking that, hey, this is coming up, or there's not that last minute, hey, we need extra budget money because someone has to go get this. Yes. 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 Correct. Yep. So, so this breaks this down. So if you open a user profile, so under that specialty group, you can see that shift is on here, bureau is on here, rank is on here, and then all of the certifications that you have, the different places that you end up, you can list under here. And so then I can run a report and go, okay, who all is CIT trained, but how many are on each shift? How many are first shift? How many are second shift? How many are investigators? And you can run that report by clicking like 5 buttons, and it'll pop it up however you ask, whatever questions you ask.
Back to the weapons. How many firearms are you allowed to have as a second one? And are you authorized to carry a knife, and what size knife if you're authorized?
I do not know the answers to those questions without reading the policy. I don't know that there's necessarily a limit, but I do know that they have to be approved. Yes, you can carry a knife, but there are some, like you can't carry a switchblade or, something like that. But those policies are part of the online policies that you can look up, the weapons policies that say what has to be reviewed, the memo submission, but I don't know those off the top of my head without looking it up.
The reason why I bring that up is because if you're an officer responding to another officer getting jumped or whatever, you possibly need to know how many weapons he has on him to say that the suspect is not the one that actually brought the extra weapon.
Yeah, and I could see how that could be a concern. I think that because those weapons are present and have to be approved by the armorer, the stuff you have to turn in is the make, model, serial number. So that would all come out in the investigation wash to go, hey, look, I know that this weapon is registered to you. And there would be policy violations if you brought one that was unauthorized. But all of that stuff is part of that memo. So when you turn in that memo, it has to say, I want to carry this. It's the make and model. It's this caliber. Here's the serial number. And so those are all on record. Yes. Which, to be fair, it's going to be after the incident anyway, because that's not going to be a question that anybody's going to stop to answer. If there's a gun present and it is an immediate threat, that's going to have to be addressed regardless of who brought it to the scene or where it came from. But those documents do exist. We used O-drive files and hard drive files just like everybody else, just filing systems. And I think the hardest part is searching them. You could find the stuff, but it was not quick. You had to look through. And so they would go to, the system's actually called Power DMS, which is where we do our policies and we sign off. And they're there. It just takes a lot longer to find them because of how those files sort. Whereas this has search functions where like you can search by learning objective, you can search by the name of the class, you can search by officer. And so it's just a lot more user friendly than having to sift through those saved files. And, you know, if you spell the word wrong, it gives you no results. And then you got to try another spelling depending on who saved it. But they're all in an online file. It's just not as user friendly.
How is retraining? Is the same thing? When an officer gets in trouble and say you send him to remedial training? Yeah.
It depends on the situation. You know, sometimes, I'm trying to think of a good example, but Ruben can speak to like the FTO program. So we'll get officers who hit the street, kind of lose their words or get tongue tied. And so we will pull people off and take them up to our mat room, our training room, and give them more scenario-based training. If it's a search and seizure issue, if we see issues where they're trying to search a vehicle and they can't, we would pull them out and do legal updates training. So it just depends on what the deficiency is that is identified. If it's a firearms deficiency, a lot of times they'll go out one-on-one with a firearms instructor and train the minute details of trigger pull and weapon, you know, how you hold the weapon and your stance and all the things that implement. So it just depends on what we're trying to remediate. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And Ruben's, the FTO program is actually moving to this system as well, where it will be tied to the individual officers. This will track an individual officer's training record from their date of hire for the people who have just hired until they retire. So every single document will be in here, including their FTO phases. And everything, like he said, those forms are in here and it allows like they're meeting the expectation or they're below or they're above. If the field training officer deems you below or above, it mandates that you put in the comments for what, and then it kicks it back and says, okay, what are you doing to fix it? So we're documenting, and all those are logged hours. Like you would never remediate someone and not track what it was. Okay. We'll be back same time next week on Thursday at Washburn University. So if more comes up, I can also give you guys my contact information. I'm always available. I have no problems answering questions or concerns. We're always looking for, you know, outside people who want to train in law enforcement. I have no issues with transparency, bringing people to the table. I think all the heads you can get together just make us better. So I appreciate you guys coming out and spending your Wednesday night with me.